that I found in I think it's a 1970 book, Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. And she writes about stories and how stories are forgotten or destroyed because of how powerful they are. And this has a real, it rings a bell with me because when I was in fourth grade, I grew up in Vermont, I grew up in Rutland. And in fourth grade, of course, you study Vermont history in fourth grade. And I remember thinking, oh, this is really exciting. I'm going to find out about all the people around me in Rutland, which there was the Italian part of town, the Polish part of town, the Irish part, the French part. The churches all had their own languages. You get the picture. And I'm French, Canadian, Irish, and Lebanese. So I was just so excited. I was so naive. I was going to learn all about my people and the people around me and what they were all doing there. And of course, I get the little green book on Vermont history, and as I'm turning the pages, of course, none of those people was there, of course, and women weren't there either. And I remember really shrinking inside, kind of thinking, oh my gosh, why aren't any of these people around me in this book? And my 9th grade logic said, well, they're not in the book because they never did anything important. And I just kept, and I remember that by the time that I kept looking in other books, it piqued my mind to look in other books and see what was in them. And by the time I was 13, I was totally ashamed of my heritage because nobody like me had ever done anything important. So when I got to be a teacher, my first teaching assignment was in Swanton, Vermont, teaching 4th grade, teaching Vermont history, and they gave me the same book to teach my students. And I remember saying a few expletives that I can't repeat here, and then saying, somebody has to write a new story about Vermont. This is absolutely ridiculous that this book is still being taught. So I really made it my life's work. That was a long time ago. That was probably about 40 years ago that happened. So I made it my life work to find other stories that haven't been told, that aren't told in the traditional history books. So I found a lot of interesting stories, and this is another one of those forgotten stories that I'm going to talk about tonight. This is the reason I started studying this particular story about Heinsberg, Vermont, was that it's near me. This is an 1857 map, so South Burlington isn't on here. There was no South Burlington at that time, but South Burlington is somewhere around here. And I noticed in the census that I kept running into two names of African Americans, Prince Peters and Shubal Clark. And these names were there decade after decade after decade, and here in Heinsberg, the square town down here in southern Chittenden County. So I started going there in my spare time to try to find, I thought, well, they owned land, maybe there's some information in the town clerk's office. So I started going in my spare time to try to discover where these folks lived. And I discovered this hill right here. This is the road. This is called Lincoln Hill today. It's had other names, but this is Lincoln Hill. And I discovered that this is where they lived, and that there is an abandoned black cemetery up here toward the top of the hill, just before it went into, this is Huntington, just before it went into Huntington. So this hill in northern Vermont, starting in the 1790s, had a relative high percentage of African Americans, and they were farmers. They were free farmers. And basically, I said to myself, these are just pretty basic historical and geographical questions. Well, why here and why now? Why were they there on that hill? It's still an isolated hill today. It's still not paved. It's still a dirt road. It's pretty isolated. And why in 1795 the first folks came, 1795, 1798. So why here, why now, just after statehood? I'm not sure I ever totally answered those questions, but I answered a lot of questions that I hadn't ever asked myself by searching through all of these different types of primary sources. I started just in my spare time going to the town clerk's office, looking through land transactions, historical maps, all kinds of things. I mean, you can read the list. But these right here, these are really exciting to find. These are grand lists, and you can see that there are people's names, and then it had their houses and how much their houses are worth and how many cows they had, and it was all for tax purposes. So I found a bunch of these, and you can see this one is all, it's animal skin. They were all rolled up in the back of the town clerk's office and tied with little ribbons. And I don't know when the last time some of those had ever been opened, but it was really exciting to find them. So I actually unrolled most of them and, took down a lot of information, tax information. I didn't unroll all of them. Some of them, when I started unrolling them, they started falling apart, so I didn't do that. But I made some pretty exciting finds, some old maps that were hidden away that nobody knew was there in the town clerk's office. So it was pretty exciting. Also, when I found out where they lived, I could go to the landscape and I could still see things that their hands had made. Stone walls. This here is a foundation for a barn. And the way I know it was the foundation for a barn is I had an archaeologist with me as we were walking around. And he said, well, this is the exact dimensions of a barn, of a 19th century barn. So we knew it wasn't a house, it wasn't something else, it was a barn. So I can tell you exactly where their barns were. And this picture here is the picture of the cemetery the way it looks today. It has only, this right here, it's kind of hard to see, but that's a field stone that's standing up. So a field stone would have been used in the really early days to mark a place where somebody was buried. The rest of the cemetery is pretty much destroyed. There's nothing there. There are some shards on the ground. There are people who remember when it was an intact cemetery, but the stones have been either destroyed or stolen and taken away, and people tell me they've seen them in people's barns holding doors open and that sort of thing. So that was a real disappointment on a lot of different levels to see that. But there is still a lot of, when I first started this research, I didn't expect to find this evidence on the land. I thought I might find some in the town clerk's office, but I was really surprised to find all of the evidence that's still left. And a woman who, this barn goes with the Schubel-Clark household, and the woman built a new house up there maybe 20 years ago, and she said when she built the house, she filled in a cellar hole on the front lawn. So that the cellar hole of that original homestead is still there, protected under the ground. I asked her once if she would allow people to come and dig it up, and archaeologists to dig it up, and if they put it back exactly the way they found it. And she said she might. She would think about it. So there's all this wonderful evidence still there, which has been called History in Waiting by Henry Louis Gates. So there's still more history in waiting on this hill. And I might add a lot of other hills around Vermont. This isn't the only one that's like this. This is the old map that I found that nobody knew was in existence. And you can see right here that it says Prince and Samuel Peters. And I only started out with two names, Prince Peters, Schubel-Clark. Those are the only two names. And I ended up finding so many more names that weren't in the census. So here's a Samuel Peters. So that's the first time I run into him. And the road goes like this. And then there's an L. Clark. He's also African American. And then the road keeps going like this. And it says Yaw and Clark here. And that's the Clark family, Schubel-Clark. So as I kept going back and forth to the town clerk's office, I kept adding more names. And from those two names on the census, they became these many names for one family. This is for the Schubel-Clark family up here. They came from Connecticut, New Milford, Connecticut, to first Moncton, Vermont, and then Heinsberg at the top of that hill. And they had 9 children who were born there in Vermont. And then I kept running into some of these other names sometimes, Williams and Langley and I didn't know who they were, but eventually I figured out that everybody's related. Everybody was related. The yellow here is, I think he was enslaved. I think Edward Williams was enslaved. He's the only one who lives up there who couldn't sign his name. He signed an X, and he says that he was born in Maryland, usually. In 1860, he says he was born in Vermont, but all the other times he said he was born in Maryland, and I think that's because he was afraid of the Fugitive Slave Act. So you would say you were born in Vermont in 1860. Green stands for veterans. All of these greens happen to be veterans of the Civil War. And blue stands for people who have been identified, documented as being on the Underground Railroad. So here's a story of blacks helping blacks, which we don't tell in Vermont very often. It's always this other story of, whites helping helpless blacks. But here's, the real story of, and two of these families documented as being on the Underground Railroad. And then here's the other one. This is Prince Peter's, and this is what Prince Peter's ended up to be, huge, just an enormous amount of people on one hill, way up in the country in Vermont, isolated. It's just these big extended families, they're wonderful. And I don't very often find people who were born on this hill moving away. When somebody marries somebody in that family, they came to this hill. They lived on the hill with them. So there's something really special about that spot that they chose, that Prince Peters and Jubal Clark chose. I think, let me see what this next one is. Well, Prince Peters was a Revolutionary War veteran. This is his pension record. So this was wonderful to find a pension record, because I found not everybody who fought in the Revolution has or the Civil War or the War of 1812. They don't all have pension records. You only applied for a pension if you were really destitute in those days. So it's lucky for the historians when you find a pension record. It's not so great for the people who were applying for it. Obviously he was in difficult straits like that. This is not his picture, obviously, but a picture of a reenactor during the Revolution. African Americans were fighting for a different reason than whites were fighting in the Revolutionary War. They were fighting for their freedom. They believed in the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. They believed what the leaders of the Revolution told them, that they would free the slaves if they won the war. And so many African Americans fought on they fought on both sides. They fought on the Patriot side and they fought on the British side. Sometimes when I'm teaching teachers or teaching kids, I say to them, okay, who picked the right side? One's who picked the Patriots, the other one's who picked the British. So it's a nice question for kids to debate. Prince Peters was in a little bit of trouble. But it's great. I learned the names of all of his children. I learned their ages, what year they were probably born. He called himself old age. He fought. He signed up at 16 from Massachusetts to fight in the Revolutionary War. So in 1880, what does that make him in 1818? Who's good at math? Not that old. By our standards, it's not that old. By the standards of the times, he was really feeling it. But some of this brings me back to, so why, after the Revolutionary War, why did he decide to come up to Heinsberg, Vermont? Why did he decide to come to Vermont at all? There is the Blind African Slave, Jeffrey Grace book. You might be familiar with that. He talks in that book about after the Revolutionary War. He says he heard some good things about Vermont, so he thought he'd come up and find out if it was a good place to live. So, and it may be just that. A lot of people were hearing good things about Vermont after the Revolution, and we were the fastest growing state in the nation for 2 decades after that. So it may have just been that. I don't know.
The Constitution of Vermont abolishing slavery?
Well, it abolished the enslaved until you were 18 for a woman, 21 for a man. Nobody was sitting around saying, let's see, when were you born? Oh yeah, it's time, you need to be free tomorrow. You know what I mean? Nobody's sitting around with that. So there's a lot of stories about, there was slavery in Vermont, and it lasted long after the 1777 Constitution. Some people, if you knew the law and you knew how to get what you needed, people may have been freed when they were 18 or 21. There was also a law soon after the 1777 Constitution that made it illegal to sell African Americans out of state when they were reaching their age of majority. So there's all kinds of stuff going on like that. Dinah White was enslaved in was it Windsor? Near here, in Windsor, till she was in her 80s. And then her master threw her out and the town had to take care of her. So there was a lot of slavery, and there was also a lot of, Jeffrey Brace talks about having his kids taken away from him and indentured out. And he said the only reason that anybody in this town was taking my kids away from me was because I'm a black man. And they don't think that I can bring up my children, in the correct fashion. So it was, this wasn't the, what's the word? It wasn't the Shangri-La, of the United States here. It was still could be pretty dangerous to live here. So that's one reason that I'm guessing, because I never found any early writings, but one reason I'm guessing they moved to this hill was that it was so isolated. It was so isolated from whites who would keep blacks under constant surveillance and maybe take the children away from them and indenture them out. They didn't want that. So I think one reason may have been just it was so incredibly isolated. Oh, I just like to show this. This is Lemuel Haynes, who was the minister in Rutland for about 30 years. And he said in a poem in 1778, I think he wrote this poem, exactly why it was that he fought the revolution. He just, much better those in death consigned than a surviving slave. Another reason I think that they may have chosen this hill was that if the top of the hill faces southwest, and it gets a lot more sunshine than the bottom of the hill. And the top of the hill, the Clark settled at the top of the hill, and they turned it into a very successful farm. So I think maybe they knew exactly what they were doing, even though it was very difficult to get up that hill. It was virgin territory for quite a long time. It was difficult getting up. The trees were probably 6 feet around. There were mosses and fallen over trees with the roots pulled up. You couldn't use a wagon to get up there when they first came. You were really hacking your way through the wilderness to get up there. But I think they knew that it was a good place. It was a good place for the farm. After a while, I see a survey going over the hill, a road being surveyed over the hill. So they did. Eventually, there was a road built over the hill. Made it easier for them to get up. And I know from the tax records that they had a wagon, they had a horse. They had a number of items like this. So it got a little bit easier once they got settled in on this hill. And I find in the general store in town that people were going to the store and buying the butter. They would say, I bought the butter of Miss Clark or the butter of Miss Langley. So they at least in the beginning, it seemed to be a pretty friendly, rural atmosphere on this hill. And they were up on the hill, they had a good farm, they were making cheese, they were making butter, they were selling it to the general store. People were coming in to get their butter. They weren't coming in getting just anybody's butter. This is a picture from New York, but I kind of like the picture. So they were going to be bringing barrels like that down to the general store. So I think it was pretty friendly in the early days, right? Right after the revolution, the fervor of revolution and equality and justice. Some good things seem to be going on here. They joined the Baptist church. They joined the conservative Baptist church, the Baptist church that believed in predestination. Even though there was a Free Will Baptist church nearby in Huntington that was started by Charles Bowles, African-American minister, they never joined his church for some reason. They stuck with this conservative Baptist church in Heinsberg. But they became members of the church. Their children became members of the church. Some of the Peters family also became members of this church. So this was a biracial church in Heinsberg, Vermont, in the very early 19th century. Schubel Clark, whose name is spelled a lot of different ways, but Schubel became a leader in the church. He was put on committees to go and investigate people who were wayward in the church, and he and his committee would go back time and time again to try to talk people into changing their ways and coming back to the church and acting, the way good Baptists would. And it was interesting because he was the only African American on these committees. So there's an African American man and maybe one white guy or maybe two, and they'd be going and chastising, white members of the congregation, which to me, it blows my mind a little bit, because people were accepting that. It was just fine that this man was coming and chastising him. He was obviously a really upstanding member of the community, and I only ran into one little teeny notation once, where somebody was upset that a black man had come to talk to them. Other than that, it just seemed to be fine. Until Schubel's son got in a little trouble. His son was Lewis Clark, and I found in the Baptist church records, it said, Brother Lewis J. Clark and Sister Ruth Brown did unlawfully lodge together, which we think is contrary to the gospel. And because they have not come forward and made a confession to the church, they have forfeited their right of being in fellowship with the church until they shall truly and voluntarily make that confession that the offense demands. Well, they never came forward and apologized for anything. But I find, just maybe 3 years later, this list of the Baptist Heinsberg Church and all of the people in the church who are the wealthiest people, and I found Lewis J. Clark right there in the list, $1,171. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One is that in these early days, if your son could afford to buy land and have a farm separate from you, you had really made it. And it would be a sign that your family, was really upstanding, and you would stay, and you would be leaders of the community, and your descendants would still be there today, and everybody would know that you were, one of the founding fathers and mothers of the town. So the fact that Lewis J. Clark, we saw that on that map too, moved away from his father's farm and his mother's farm and had his own 100 acres on the hill is pretty significant for that family, that they had moved up that high in the social standings in the community. And I think, because I don't have any other writings except the Baptist church records, that, well, I do know that they went and invited Lewis Clark and Ruth Brown back into the church. They didn't go and apologize. That they had a committee that went to them and asked them to come back and said, we're sorry, we think we acted hastily in your case, and we really want you to come back. So Lewis came back to the church. It took 5 years for Ruth to come back. I think it took her 5 more years to I don't know, maybe somebody actually had to go and apologize to her, I don't know. But I think it took her 5 more years to forgive them for what they had done to her. So, and I wondered why they did that. And this is my only piece of evidence right here, saying, oh, they needed his money. Maybe they needed his money, I don't know. Maybe they were going to build a building, because in the early days you would meet in somebody's house. Maybe they're going to build a building now, and this is a campaign for people's money, I don't know. So it's very interesting, but you know, this is what we do with these primary sources. You have to make a lot of, you know, they're not guesses, but they're interpretations based sometimes on today. Yeah, the church needs people's money. Or, you know, interpretations on any little clues that you can get. So this is a successful family. This is a very successful family up there. And then I found inventories, which are really interesting. I'm just going to show you a few of these. Just point out a couple things. This inventory of Prince Peter's, and he died in 1832. Right here, it says that his house is standing on Samuel Peter's land. I thought that was fascinating. It's not something that people of European descent, I've never found that in the records, and I have looked back and forth from, you know, the records of people from European descent to African descent to try to see, you know, what's different, or is everything just the same? Is this something that people of European descent did at that time too? And I haven't found that. But I found it here, and I found it up at the top of the hill at the Clark homestead, where people are building their houses on somebody else's land, even though they own land where they could have built their house. So my interpretation of this is, this could be a tradition brought over from it, where people put their houses together. And it makes me wonder where Prince Peter's and Shubal Clark were born, and Violet Clark, and Hannah Lensman is Prince Peter's wife. With that generation, very well could have been born in Africa and brought here. I don't know, because by the time I run into them, they're free blacks.
Have you ever found out really established where they came from?
Well, Massachusetts and Connecticut, I know that's where they came from just before they came to Vermont.
No.
But before that, I haven't found anything before that. So there's still some history in waiting somewhere. You know, I still would like to know that. Yeah.
Do you know what age they were when they settled in Vermont? That generation, the first generation?
Yeah, they had toddling children at the time. So the women were of an age where they had, and then they had a lot more children afterwards. So they were, I think, in their, you know, I'm kind of guessing, but the only one I really know is Violet Clark, because she died at 80, she was 83 years old in 1862. So she's the younger, so I'm pretty sure that that was probably a good date and a good age. But so they were, you know, of childbearing age when they first came.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But there's research that has been done that says that generation, that they were, a large percentage of that generation was born in Africa. But I don't know if they were or not. They also could very well have been born here. They could have been free all their lives. They could have been enslaved, I don't know. Prince Peter's could have been, if he was enslaved, his service in the Revolutionary War would have freed him. So I don't know, I never answered that question about, you know, where they came from.
But when you say this is Prince Peter's inventory, this is his handwriting too? I mean, he could read, right?
No, when you died, somebody assigned you, somebody had to go take the inventory, and that person would go in the house and write down everything that was in the house.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I don't know. I have some signatures on items, and I don't know if they wrote them or not, the really early generation, but I have a bunch of signatures from later on. But another thing that's really interesting is just the whole communal, this, if you can read the handwriting, I'll point out some more things, just has a real communal feel to it. Starting with the house. Their houses are together, right on the same little house, right on the same house lot. Prince owned a half a pair of oxen, which farmers tell me that that's really important. If you said one ox, they're not worth as much as a half a pair. Take a look at how much this half a pair is worth, $27.50. The only thing worth more than that on here is the house. They're worth almost as much as the house. That's because if you have a pair of them, they're trained together. And that's really, really important. So he owned half of it. So I'm assuming Samuel owned the other half. So they own things in common. A half a gun. I love that. When I first started looking at these and seeing these halves, I'd see like a half a stove, and I'm thinking, trying to get my mind around half a stove. How do you do that? I don't get that. So, but now you know, whenever you see this, it's just things that are owned in common. A half a cider mill. Is there something else you want me to try to read for you? Thirds later. Yeah. And then you can see things like they have all this flax there. So I like the inventories also, and they have 2 wheels, a shuttle, and flax. So now I can start picturing what the women were doing. They were making linen. They had 2 wheels. That's really good. These folks are doing okay. I don't want to spend too much. I can spend a lot of time on each one of these, but I'll try to go real fast. This is when Shubal Clark died in 1832. There was an inventory, but her son Lewis was the executor of the estate, and I don't know what happened to Lewis, but he was not doing his job. And Violet had to write to the probate court, to the judge, to say, my executor's not doing his job, I need to have my dower, which is 1/3 of the estate. And so the judge, this is the letter saying, okay, Lewis Clark, these are the things that you have to give to Violet Clark, this is her dower. So that was interesting in itself to me, and I've run into this a number of times, especially with women, writing to judges and saying, wait a minute, I'm not getting what's due to me, and the judges turn around and say, well, you're right, and order people to do, what they should do then. And I like this because she has 100 sap tubs. So now I can add a sugar bush. The whole time I'm trying to add, so there's this blank slate, and I'm just trying to add things in. Okay, we've got the houses here, a couple houses there, they've got the sugar bush. I know they've got the flax, I know they've got, like 3 tons of wheat, so I can just keep adding these pictures and try to figure out what their lives were like. She's got, this is the half-cooked stove. She's sharing it with her son. She has a son who's a shoemaker, and he lives with her until she dies. And then he leaves the hill, but he does live with her, so she's sharing that with him. I also found in Huntington, this is the scholars in Huntington. I found one of the Langley girls married a guy from Rutland whose name was Langley, whose name was William Langley. And he was born in Rutland in 1794. So there's quite a large African American community in Rutland at this time. And so he moves to the hill. She doesn't move to Rutland with him. He moves up here to this isolated hill in Heinsberg. And they have a number of children. They have 6 children. But in 1829, I can see that 2 of them are going to this little school in Huntington, number 8 schoolhouse. And I actually found the schoolhouse. It's sitting in the backyard of a guy who's a preservationist. He bought the schoolhouse. He moved it to his backyard, so it's still sitting there. The school that they went to. So we've got the biracial church, we've got, obviously the biracial stores, now we've got the biracial schools up here on the hill. And we'll see a little bit later that one of these Langleys, you can tell that they have a wonderful education up there. This is a little house that I kept passing. I go up if you go in this direction, the cemetery is right there. It abuts this property. And this is during the time when I never expected to find anything except the cemetery. I went by this house a million times, going back and forth, doing research. And suddenly one day I said, oh my gosh, wait a minute. Take off the porch, take off that. You just have this little cape with the chimney a little bit off center. It's exactly the style that would have been built up on that hill 1820s maybe. So I think this is the Langley house. I think that they built their own house. Again, they built it on Shubal Clark's and Violet's land, put it here, and this has been documented as being on the Underground Railroad. This is one of the homes, Elmira Clark and William Langley's home. It was sold recently, and I noticed that they were online. They were advertising it as an historic Underground Railroad house. I don't know if that helped sell it or not, but it's funny. But so William Langley, this is another quick little court story. William Langley borrowed 47 sheep, I have it actually written down. My old age, I have to write everything down. 47 sheep. Oh no, just diverse cows and sheep. They borrowed diverse cows and sheep from a neighbor, a white neighbor by the name of Norton. And it says that in the records that was customary amongst farmers, that you would loan people your, if they needed some animals or if they needed the manure from the animals, I don't know, or maybe both, you would just borrow back and forth. It was fine. And what he owed back was 47 sheep and 47 pounds of wool by 1842. And so 1842, and some money. He also had to give $48. So in 1842, he goes to, he wants to pay Norton, was his name. But Norton has died, and Amanda Norton, his daughter, is now the executor of the estate. And Amanda Norton says, I've got all the wool, I've got all the sheep, I'm giving them back to you. I don't quite have the $48 yet, though. I'll get that to you. And she said, no, you don't have the $48, then I own your farm. I own your house, I own your property, which was worth about $500 at the time. And he knew his rights, and he knew exactly what to do, and he sued her. And it was in court for a while, but he won the suit against her. And the judge told her that she had to accept the sheep, she had to accept the wool, and he'd have a couple more years to get the money together, and at the end of the 2 years, he had the money together, and he gave that. So it's a very long court case that I found in Superior Court in Burlington. But it's another one of those examples of, they weren't going to take anything from anybody. They knew what their rights were. So that story ended happily. But just after this story, William Langley's wife dies, Elmira dies, so she's buried in that cemetery. And just shortly before that, her sister Phoebe dies, so she's buried in the cemetery. And a grandson of Violet Clark died. So I'm imagining Violet, she's buried 2 daughters, and she's burying a grandson in a very, very quick succession back there. I started picturing everything through Violet's eyes after a while, because she was there the longest of anybody. So I started picturing it through her eyes. This is the only gravestone I found, and this gravestone is of the Peters. This is Prince Peters had one of his sons was Josephus Peters, and he married Charlotte. I think her name was Bettis. She might have been Abenaki. There's some oral tradition that she may have been Abenaki. And I found this grave. It's not on the hill at all. It's about a mile away from the hill, near a farm where Josephus worked as a laborer. But it was really exciting to find at least one gravestone, because this is the only gravestone of that generation, of the first 2 generations that I found. And I found it near this house, and this is the earliest picture that I have of anybody African American on that hill. And I think that these are some of the Peters men who worked for this McEwen farm about a mile away from their house on the hill. And in the family, there's oral tradition that says that they were really good horsemen and that they took care of the horses. And here they are standing in the driveway with some horses. It's pretty exciting. And I focused in and got as close as I can and tried to see their faces, but I can't see them.
What year is this?
This, I think, was, I can only guess from the dress. So people thought maybe the end of the 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, maybe. And this is a picture that hangs in that house today. And the people who own that house had me come over one time, and they said, oh, we'll show you all around the house. Look at the picture, look at this beautiful picture. Then they turned the picture over, and there was a note on the back. They knew the note was there. There was a note on the back of it, typewritten note from the time period. And it said, let me show you the next, I'll show you the next picture, because it's about this. This is the cemetery out the back. And it said that the sons of Josephus Peters were to carry when the man died, whom they were working for. When he died, he left something for these guys. He said they were to carry the body to the grave, which was on his own farm, and lower it into its last resting place, fill the grave with earth, and then walk back to the house where they were to find each a letter, sealed and directed to them, which was the money to pay for this last service. They did the work and received the sealed letters, but what sum of money was therein is not yet transpired. And that's, so this note was there from 1870. He died in 1870. So this was a typewritten 1870s note about what he wanted the Peters men to do for him. And they continued working on that farm for quite a long time. I'll just show this real quick, because this is something else that sometimes people don't know, that there exists an agricultural census. It was only taken for maybe 3 years, and I found all the Clark farm on this agricultural census in 1860, only 1 year. Now, every farm didn't get on the census. Only farms that were really successful, that were marketable, got on this agricultural census. So it was pretty exciting to find that the Peters farm wasn't on it, but the Clark's farm was. And what I did was I just took all the Clark farms, because they had 3 of them, but they were all farming communally up there at the top of the hill. I took them all and I put them together into one, and then I compared them to some white farms nearby. I just wanted to see what was going on here. So just a couple of things. One thing, and these are just farmers who look at this and say, oh my gosh, they've only got 6 cows, but look at how much butter they got. Where's the butter? 1,800 pounds of butter. Farmers are always, what does it say? I mean, farmers are always, they kind of fall out of their chairs and say, wait a minute, that's really good. That's the best you can get out of those animals. You couldn't get an ounce more out of 6 cows. And the same things with the sheep. They have 8, but they've got 32 pounds of wool from those sheep. They say the same thing, those good merino rams, that's the best you can get out of them. So, I mean, if just being on the agricultural census wasn't enough, and having their son buy a farm nearby wasn't enough to say, how successful they were and what good farmers they were, here's another example of what good farmers they were. What they didn't have was a lot of animals by this time. And if you don't have a lot of animals, and you're also leaving that friendly rural economy by now, where people are wanting to expand their farms and getting a little bit more greedy, and you're not going to be sharing your animals like they did in the earlier days with William Langley, it's tough. It's going to be really tough. You have to have money to go. You have to buy back guano from South America, for heaven's sakes. It's pretty expensive. So you can see here that they are not specializing like some of these other farms are. I mean, you look at Livermore here, you can see they don't have any sheep, but 8,000 pounds of cheese. So here's the beginning of the cheese industry in Heinsberg. There was quite a large cheese industry in Heinsberg up into the 20th century. So you can just see you can see that some folks who started to specialize, they have enough animals to keep their farm fertile, and the Clarks did not at this point. And then, of course, the Civil War starts. Historians talk about historical empathy a lot. How do you get to see the world through the eyes of the people that you're researching. And one way, of course, is by letters. And I did by this generation, this is now the third generation on the Hill. By the third generation, I start finding some letters, and they're from soldiers who are writing back home. So some of these, the Peters men joined the Heinsberg militia, but the Clark men and men who had married women and moved to the Hill joined the Massachusetts 54. And they are always writing home about the exact same thing. And the one thing that they're always writing home about is that they're not getting paid the same way white soldiers are getting paid. And they complain about that a lot. And this is where I find Loudon Langley. And Loudon Langley, almost the minute he leaves Vermont, is writing letters back home to the editor of the Burlington Free Press, to the Green Mountain Freeman, writing letters to African American magazines. And here's just one. I just want to read a part of one of his letters to you so you can get a flavor for this guy. So this is March 9, 1864, from Jacksonville, Florida. And he says, "Editors of the Free Press, you are aware that we, the Vermont men in this regiment, left Brattleboro January 23rd. For I saw it stated in the Sentinel that almost a mutiny occurred among the colored soldiers regiment, because the white soldiers received $75 and the black soldiers received nothing. This, although coming from the Sentinel, is nevertheless true. It is also true that they, the colored soldiers, had expected to be treated in this respect the same as the white soldiers, especially as they counted on the quota of the state. I may say that if the boys had had their arms, that every man of them would have died on the spot before leaving camp without the payment of their just due." I'd love to know exactly where in Brattleboro that was. I'm sure somebody knows. As it was, they showed unmistakable signs that they had pluck, so much that it was feared by the officers that they would have trouble with us, and so recourse had to be falsehood. We were told that owing to our going into a regiment from another state, our $75 had been sent to the headquarters of our regiment, where we would be paid off as soon as we arrived. A falsehood that even Satan himself would blush to promulgate. Suffice it to say that we have sent a letter to our excellent Governor J. Gregory Smith complaining of our grievances and asking for the interposition of his executive authority on our behalf. So this is just one of his, all of his letters are like this. They're just beautiful. They're beautiful 19th century prose. I've never seen the handwriting though, because they're all letters to the editor. You know, they're published in magazines. So I haven't seen his handwriting. I wish I could. So Loudon Langley, so they all joined the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first black northern regiment. Loudon Langley, when they get down to South Carolina, runs into the South Carolina 33rd, which was the first black regiment in the country. A little argument about that. Might have been Kansas, but most people say.
That one off, like Port Royal?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yep, down in Bedford.
Susie and Taylor King.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one. But so he joins, and I love this picture. Oh, it's red, you can't see it, because they had blue jackets and red pants, the South Carolina 33rd. They were actually organized illegally before they had, the federal permission to be organized to fight. And then the second the Emancipation Proclamation was read, they were organized into the South Carolina 33rd, or they were actually the first South Carolina. They became the South Carolina 33rd later. But so Loudon Langley moves from 54th to South Carolina 33rd, saying that he's so proud to be in the first black regiment organized. So he was really happy to fight for them. His cousin Aaron Freeman was also down and I have his handwriting. This is why I put this up there. It's so exciting to find their handwriting. So this is Aaron Freeman, and he also writes home to his former employer, who happens to be the Robinsons up at Rokeby in Ferrisburg. I don't know if you've been there, but yeah, he worked for them. And so he's writing back to them saying, sorry for the scribbling, it's a hard place to write, but I think the writing is absolutely gorgeous. And he writes back and he says, one of his big complaints is this. He says, when we go out to drill in the thistle, they make them that have got boots take them off. And we have to go drill in the thistle with bare feet, and then they sit on their horses and laugh at us. That ain't right. But that's a quote from him. I don't have to read that one. I've got that one memorized. So he's complaining not only about the pay, but he also is complaining about how they're treated by the white officers in Massachusetts 54. I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quickly here. But Loudon Langley marries Jane from Burlington. And they go down to South Carolina and live there for the rest of their lives after the end of the war. And here you can see right here, these are the delegates to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1868, where they had to rewrite their constitution to be accepted back into the Union. And here's a list of the delegates, and there's L.S. Langley right there. Along with, where's his name? Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls is a really famous, during the war he was on a ship, and he and his crew take over the ship and take it to Charleston and turn it over to the Union Army. So he became really, and he used the money from that to buy the house where he had been enslaved. So that's a wonderful story. And Loudon Langley, the Langleys lived next to Robert Smalls down in Beaufort, South Carolina. He's down there, he's on the school board, he's becomes the auditor of accounts for Beaufort, taking land away from the Confederates and selling it to other people. He must have had a lot of fun with that. So he became a very powerful man down there. And the reason I have this here is that this is a park down in Beaufort. It's called Langley Park, named after Loudon Langley, born in Huntington, Vermont, 1836. And I love that tree there. So this is Langley Park. He used to own that land. And I don't know who this young woman is, but I just thought that is, I was imagining that Jane might dress like that, during this time period. This is a young woman from St. Albans, Vermont, and there's no name on the back, just as St. Albans, so I don't know who she is. So that's Loudon Langley. He, shortly after, the end of Reconstruction, he had to get another job. He talked about in his pension records, having a hard time finding a job because he had hurt his back in the war, but the only job he could find, I wonder if I have a picture of it. No, I don't think I do. But the only job he could find was lugging 50-pound barrels of oil up to the top of a lighthouse on Hunting Island. So he became an assistant lighthouse keeper. This family, I think, is the epitome of the highs and lows of, expectations in Reconstruction. They were up there, they were high, they were, in the ruling class and rewriting the Constitution, and you can read what he said at the Constitutional Convention, because that's all written down too. So, it's just wonderful. And then to find out at 41, he dies, and his friends down there blamed it on having to lug the 50-pound oil cans up to the top of this lighthouse. So he dies. He's buried in the National Cemetery down there. Sergeant Major L.S. Langley. This is where I found out his middle name was Schubel, so he's named after his grandfather, Schubel Clark. Sergeant Major was the highest rank that an African American could attain at that time. I was sure I would find a picture of him, but I've never found a picture of him. Pretty disappointed about that. This is his daughter, though. This is Jane and Loudon's daughter. She moved out to Ohio, met Harry Proctor, they were married. And this is their, great-great-great-grandson, I think. He lives in Framingham, Massachusetts now. And he took for his first name Langley. His name is Langley Proctor. It was his middle name, he was Edward Langley Proctor, but he's so proud of his heritage, he switched Langley, as he now has For his first name, he has Langley. And at the bottom of this hill in Huntington, there's a historical marker now for the early black settlers that were there. One side is for the Clark family, and the other side is for the Peters family, which is kind of nice. Usually the same on both sides, so we were happy to be able to get both of those families on there. But one thing I like to end with is that there's a lot of enduring issues across the decades of this family. But one thing that I've been noticing as I study history is that generally history is told like this. History is progress. We're just started here and we're making constant progress, right up to, someday we'll make it, where everybody is treated equally. But that's what progress is. It's the way I was always taught history, and it's the way that history is still taught in schools, and I'm really concerned about that. But I think what this is it's taking like the high points. The real history looks like this. But if we're only looking at the high point, sure it looks like progress, doesn't it? It looks like there's constant progress. Well, I don't think there is. If you think about this story, after the revolution, I think these folks were flying high, and they came up, they lived in Heinsberg and Huntington, they built really successful farms, really successful lives, had an extended family around them, which in New England was very difficult to do. Generally, grandparenthood among African Americans was unknown in New England because you only wanted one or two servants or a man to work out in the fields. So the minute a woman got pregnant, the baby was gone. So grandparenthood really was not known. And here they were on this hill with this big extended family, grandparents, great-grandparents. But then, things fell apart. Things started falling apart. They were, and then, African Americans were really excited about 1808 when, no more kidnapping people from Africa, supposedly, but the law says, okay, no. That in 1808 at midnight, the bells were ringing, people were singing, people were dancing. They thought, finally, this is the end. This is the end of slavery. Well, no, not yet. That didn't work out. And so if we miss all of these low points, we're not getting what history really is. We're not getting what progress is. There's no such thing. This is obviously just artificial. So there's my little commercial about progress and the way it's taught in schools, because I think it's not taught correctly. So, thanks.